20 years ago, Enterprise ending gave Star Trek the chance for a rebirth, but it took years. When Star Trek Enterprise aired its final episode, These Are the Voyages, on May 13, 2005, the mood among fans was complicated. On one hand, the series marked the end of nearly 2 decades of continuous Star Trek on television, stretching back to the Next Generation's 1987 debut. On the other, the abrupt cancellation of Enterprise after just 4 seasons felt like the franchise had reached a creative dead end. What no one realized at the time was that Enterprise's underwhelming finale and sudden demise gave Star Trek something it hadn't had in years: space to breathe. In hindsight, the series' ending 20 years ago was less the collapse of the franchise than the reset button it desperately needed, even if it took more than a decade for that rebirth to fully take shape. The end of the Berman era. By the time Enterprise concluded, the Star Trek franchise had been under the stewardship of producer Rick Berman and writer Brannon Braga for more than a decade. They had inherited the Next Generation from Gene Roddenberry and successfully shepherded it into one of the most beloved sci-fi shows of all time. Their hands were also on Deep Space Nine and Voyager, ensuring a continuous presence of Star Trek across the 1990s. But the sheer amount of content began to show. While DS9 dared to experiment with serialized storytelling and moral ambiguity, Voyager often felt like it was recycling familiar plots. Enterprise, pitched as a fresh prequel set 100 years before Kirk and Spock, was supposed to reinvigorate the formula. Instead, it struggled to justify its existence, relying too heavily on familiar tropes and suffering from unclear creative direction. By its 4th season, under new showrunner Manny Coto, Enterprise began to find its footing with stronger arcs like the Vulcan Reformation and the In a Mirror, darkly 2-parter. But by then, the network UPN had lost faith. Ratings had slipped, and for the first time since 1987, Star Trek was not considered untouchable. The finale that didn't work. If Enterprise had gone out with a satisfying ending, perhaps fans would have felt bittersweet nostalgia. Instead, These Are the Voyages became one of the most controversial finales in Star Trek history. Rather than focusing on Captain Archer and his crew in their final moments together, the episode awkwardly framed their story as a holodeck simulation aboard the Next Generation's Enterprise D. Jonathan Frakes' Riker and Marina Sirtis Troy reprised their roles, but their inclusion felt forced, reducing Enterprise's characters to background players in their own ending. Fans were furious. Instead of celebrating the crew of the NX-01, the finale seemed more interested in nostalgia for the Next Generation. Worse, character arcs were cut short, most notoriously the sudden and unnecessary death of Trip Tucker, which was treated with shocking casualness. Looking back, it's clear the finale wasn't just a failure, it was symbolic of a franchise that had lost sight of itself. Star Trek had become formulaic, self-referential, and weighed down by its own legacy. The ending of Enterprise wasn't just the end of a show, it was the end of an era. The franchise fatigue problem. By 2005, Star Trek had been producing new TV content every year for 18 straight years. Add to that 4 Next Generation films and the long shadow of the original cast movies, and audiences were showing signs of burnout. In the 1990s, weekly Star Trek episodes had been appointment viewing for millions. By the early 2000s, the landscape had shifted. Television was entering a new golden age with serialized dramas like The Sopranos, Lost, and Battlestar Galactica, all of which pushed storytelling in ambitious new directions. Against this backdrop, Enterprise's episodic format and technobabble-heavy scripts seemed dated. The cancellation was painful, but it was necessary. Without a break, Star Trek risked collapsing under the weight of overproduction and stagnation. Instead, the void created by Enterprise's ending forced the franchise to stop, reflect, and eventually reinvent itself. The silent years, 2005 to 2009. For 4 years after Enterprise's cancellation, there was no Star Trek on television. For older fans, it was a strange feeling. Since 1987, there had always been new adventures in the final frontier. Suddenly, that consistency was gone. But those silent years were crucial. Without the pressure to constantly deliver new episodes, Paramount and CBS could step back and ask what Star Trek needed to be in the 21st century. The fan base remained active through conventions, novels, and online discussions, but the franchise itself had time to rest. This break paved the way for the boldest experiment yet, handing the keys to Star Trek over to someone outside its long-running creative circle. J.J. Abrams and the reboot gamble. In 2009, J.J. Abrams released his Star Trek reboot film, reintroducing Kirk, Spock, and McCoy in a new timeline. The movie was flashy, fast-paced, and built for modern blockbuster audiences. It prioritized spectacle over philosophy, trading extended debates about morality for lens flares and phaser battles. To longtime Trekkies, Abrams' Star Trek was divisive. But to general audiences, it was a hit. The film grossed nearly $400 million worldwide, breathing life back into a franchise that had seemed culturally stagnant. For the first time in years, Star Trek was cool again. Ironically, Enterprise's failure made this reboot possible. Without a collapse in the Berman era, the studio would never have risked handing Star Trek to an outsider. And while Abrams' films didn't capture the franchise's full spirit for many fans, they kept the brand alive, relevant, and financially viable. The long road back to television. It wasn't until 2017, 12 years after Enterprise's end, that Star Trek finally returned to TV with Star Trek: Discovery. By then, the television landscape had transformed. Streaming had become the dominant medium, and serialized storytelling was the norm. Discovery leaned into that, embracing long-form arcs, darker tones, and cinematic visuals. It divided fans. Some praised its boldness, while others felt it strayed too far from Star Trek's ideals. But one thing was certain: Star Trek was back as a weekly cultural conversation, not just a film franchise. Since then, the floodgates have opened. Picard gave fans a continuation of the Next Generation era. Strange New Worlds returned to episodic adventure with a modern flair, becoming one of the most beloved new entries. Animated series like Lower Decks and Prodigy offered fresh perspectives while introducing younger audiences to the franchise. All of this rebirth traces back to the break created by Enterprise's ending. Without that pause, without that controversial finale, and without the franchise fatigue that made cancellation inevitable, Star Trek may never have reinvented itself for a new generation. Legacy of Enterprise. 20 years later, Enterprise holds a strange but important place in Star Trek history. It is remembered for its rocky first 2 seasons, its underrated fourth, and its deeply unsatisfying finale. But it is also remembered as the series that closed the book on the 1990s era of continuous Star Trek. In that sense, Enterprise's failure was a gift. It showed that Star Trek could not survive on momentum alone. It needed reinvention. It needed risk. And sometimes, the best way to ensure the survival of a franchise is to let it rest. Today, fans can look back on Enterprise with a mix of frustration and appreciation. Frustration at what might have been if the show had been given more time under Manny Coto's leadership. Appreciation that its cancellation made possible the vibrant and diverse era of Star Trek storytelling we enjoy today. Conclusion: a necessary ending. When Enterprise ended 20 years ago, it